I was standing in my bedroom, wearing nothing but my underwear, when my stepson walked in unannounced. Our eyes locked, and the air in the room changed. I should have covered myself, screamed, or pushed him out, but I didn't. Instead, I froze, letting the tension build until it became unbearable. What happened next shattered every rule I had ever followed, and there was no turning back. My name is Lauren, and I'm 41 years old. From the outside, my life looks perfect: a beautiful suburban home, a hardworking husband, and a life most people would envy. But the truth is far more complicated. My husband, Eric, is a successful financial analyst. His job is demanding, often pulling him away for long hours and frequent business trips. At first, I admired his dedication. But as the years passed, his absence left a void, one I wasn't prepared to face. I tried to keep busy, renovating the house, joining yoga classes, even volunteering at the community center. But none of it filled the emptiness I felt when I lay alone in bed at night. And then there was Caleb, Eric's 22-year-old son from his first marriage. He moved in with us after graduating college, and from the start, he brought a new energy into the house. He was confident, funny, and attentive in ways that Eric hadn't been in years. I didn't notice the shift at first. Our conversations started out simple, talks about books, movies, and weekend plans. But as time went on, the tension between us began to build. I started noticing the way his eyes lingered on me, how his compliments felt just a little too personal. And then there were the accidental touches, the brush of his hand as he passed me in the kitchen, the way his knee pressed against mine when we sat too close on the couch. I told myself it was innocent, that I was reading too much into it. But deep down I knew better. The night it all changed, Eric was out of town. I was trying on dresses for an upcoming gala, standing in front of the mirror in my underwear, when Caleb walked in. We froze. For a moment, neither of us moved. The look in his eyes, shock, desire, and something darker, sent my heart racing. I should have covered myself, screamed at him to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I let the moment stretch, the tension thickening until it felt like the room might explode. And that's when I knew everything was about to change. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment in the bedroom, how Caleb's eyes lingered on me, the heat I felt under his gaze. I told myself it was nothing, just an awkward mistake. But the way he looked at me said otherwise. And the worst part, I didn't want to forget it. I avoided him as much as I could, but the house felt smaller than ever. Every time we crossed paths, whether it was in the kitchen, the living room, or even the hallway, the tension crackled like a live wire. "Morning," Caleb said one day, leaning against the kitchen counter as I poured coffee. "Morning," I replied, keeping my eyes on the mug, hoping he wouldn't notice my trembling hands. But he noticed. "You've been acting weird lately," he said, stepping closer. "I'm fine," I said too quickly, setting the mug down and forcing a smile. He tilted his head, his eyes searching mine. "You sure about that?" I nodded, but my heart raced as he stepped even closer, his voice dropping. "Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about that night." I froze. "Caleb." "Don't," he interrupted. "You felt it too." "I know you did." I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stepped back, nearly knocking over the coffee cup. "This can't happen," I said finally, my voice trembling. He didn't move. Instead, his eyes stayed locked on mine. "Then why can't you look away?" I turned and fled, my pulse pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. But it didn't stop there. That night, Eric called to say he'd be working late again, leaving Caleb and me alone. I tried to avoid him, retreating to my room, but I couldn't escape the sound of his footsteps in the hallway or the faint knock at my door. "Lauren." I froze, gripping the edge of the bed. "What is it? Can we talk?" I hesitated but finally opened the door. He stood there, his eyes dark and unreadable. "We can't keep doing this," I said before he could speak. "Doing what?" he asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "This," I said, motioning between us. "Whatever this is." He moved closer, and I backed up until I hit the dresser. "You're lying," he said softly, his hand brushing my arm. "Caleb, please," I whispered, but my voice cracked. He leaned in, his breath warm against my skin. "Tell me you don't want this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't. Instead, I let the moment stretch, my breath shallow as his hand brushed my cheek. The tension was unbearable, and before I knew what was happening, his lips were on mine. I kissed him back. For a moment, it felt like the world stopped. But then reality came crashing down. I pushed him away, my chest heaving. "We can't," I said, tears threatening to spill. But the damage was already done. The look in his eyes told me he wasn't ready to let go, and the worst part was neither was I. I tried to tell myself it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment that could never happen again. But it did. The next morning, I avoided Caleb as much as I could, but I could feel his presence everywhere. In the kitchen, in the hallway, even when he wasn't around. It was like he had invaded my thoughts, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push him out. And then it happened again. Eric was out of town for the weekend, and I was home alone with Caleb. I thought keeping my distance would help, so I buried myself in chores and errands, trying to pretend like nothing had changed. But by evening, the house felt too quiet, too heavy with unspoken tension. I was folding laundry in my bedroom when I heard a soft knock at the door. "Lauren!" His voice sent a shiver down my spine. I hesitated before answering. "Come in." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He looked nervous, but there was something else in his eyes too, something dangerous. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "There's nothing to talk about," I replied quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, there is," he insisted, stepping closer. "You felt it too. Don't pretend you didn't." I opened my mouth to protest, but he was already standing in front of me, his hand reaching out to brush my hair back. "Caleb, we can't do this," I whispered, but even as I said it, I didn't pull away. "Then tell me to stop," he said, his voice soft but firm. I couldn't. Instead, I let him pull me closer, his lips brushing mine in a way that made my knees go weak. It was reckless, dangerous, and I didn't care. We collapsed onto the bed, the weight of everything else falling away as his hands explored my body. I knew it was wrong, but in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the way he made me feel, alive, wanted, needed. The next morning, I woke up tangled in the sheets, my heart pounding as reality hit me like a freight train. What had I done? I dressed quickly, slipping out of the room before he woke up. But as I stood in the kitchen, staring at the cup of coffee in my hands, I knew it wasn't over. And I was right. Caleb came downstairs a few minutes later, his hair messy, his t-shirt clinging to his chest in a way that made my breath hitch. "Morning," he said, leaning against the counter. I couldn't meet his eyes. "Morning. You can't pretend this didn't happen," he said, stepping closer. "I'm not pretending," I replied, forcing myself to sound calm. "I'm ending it." "No, you're not," he said, his voice steady. And he was right, because that night it happened again. I told myself it was the last time, but the truth was, I didn't want it to stop. I craved him, the way he made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. But the guilt was unbearable. Every time Eric called, I felt like a fraud. I could barely look him in the eye when he came home, afraid he'd see the truth written all over my face. And Caleb wasn't making it any easier. He started leaving little notes for me, slipping them under my door or leaving them on the kitchen counter. "I can't stop thinking about you. I need to see you tonight. You're all I want." I knew I should have thrown them away, but instead I kept them, hidden in the back of my drawer like secrets I couldn't let go of. And then one night, everything came crashing down. Eric was working late again, and Caleb and I were alone in the house. I was sitting in the living room when he walked in, his eyes locked on mine. "We need to stop," I said before he could speak. "Do you really want to?" he asked, stepping closer. I didn't answer. Instead, I let him kiss me, his hands pulling me closer as we stumbled toward the couch. But then we heard it, the sound of the front door opening. "Eric," I whispered, panic flooding through me. Caleb jumped up, running toward the back hallway just as Eric walked in. "Hey," Eric said, setting down his briefcase. "Why do you look so nervous?" I forced a smile, but my hands were trembling. "No reason," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew the truth. The walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. I barely slept that night. Every sound in the house made my heart race, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Eric's face, the suspicion in his eyes, the questions he didn't ask. I knew the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. The next morning, I avoided Caleb as much as I could. But it didn't matter. The tension between us had already reached its breaking point. Later that evening, Eric came home earlier than usual. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard the door open. "Hey," he said, setting his keys on the counter. "Hey," I replied, forcing a smile. But I could tell something was off. He didn't smile back. Instead, he leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, and looked at me like he was searching for something. An answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. "Where's Caleb?" he asked casually, but there was something sharp beneath his tone. "In his room, I think," I said, my voice shaky. He nodded but didn't say anything else. The silence felt suffocating, so I turned back to the stove, pretending to stir the sauce even though my hands were trembling. But then I heard it, footsteps on the stairs. Caleb. He walked into the kitchen, his eyes locking with mine for a split second before turning to Eric. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice calm. "Hey," Eric replied, but his eyes never left me. The tension in the room was unbearable. I turned off the stove and stepped away, my heart pounding as Eric's gaze followed me. "I need to grab something from the bedroom," I said quickly, desperate to escape. But before I could leave, Eric's voice stopped me. "Wait." I froze. "What's going on with you two?" The question hit me like a punch to the stomach. "What?" I stammered, trying to sound confused. "You heard me," he said, stepping closer. "What's going on between you and my son?" "Nothing," I said too quickly. Eric's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me, Lauren." I opened my mouth to respond, but Caleb stepped in. "Dad, stop," he said firmly. Eric turned on him, his face red with anger. "Don't you dare defend her." Caleb clenched his jaw. "I'm not defending her. I'm just saying you're overreacting." "Overreacting?" Eric shouted. "I come home, and the two of you are acting like you've got something to hide. And you think I'm overreacting?" The room was spinning. I tried to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Eric's eyes locked on mine, and for the first time I saw it, the realization. "Oh my God," he said, his voice dropping. "It's true, isn't it?" Tears filled my eyes, but I couldn't deny it. "Eric, Don't," he cut me off, his voice shaking. "Don't you dare try to explain this." He turned to Caleb, his fists clenched. "And you're my son." Caleb stepped forward. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, his voice low. "But it did," Eric shouted. The next moments were a blur. Eric lunged at Caleb, shoving him back against the counter. "Stop!" I screamed, trying to pull them apart. Caleb pushed him off. "You don't even care about her," he yelled. Eric froze, his chest heaving. "What did you just say?" Caleb's voice didn't waver. "You're never here. You leave her alone all the time, and you act like that's okay." Eric turned to me, his eyes filled with rage and betrayal. "And you let this happen?" Tears streamed down my face as I tried to speak. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I never meant to." "Don't," he said sharply, cutting me off. He grabbed his keys and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I collapsed into a chair, my body trembling as the weight of what had just happened sank in. Caleb knelt beside me, taking my hands in his. "It's going to be okay," he said softly. But I knew he was wrong. Nothing about this was okay. The next day, Eric sent a text, short and cold. "I'm filing for divorce. Don't contact me." I stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. Caleb tried to comfort me, but it didn't help. The guilt was unbearable. And no matter how much he tried to convince me that we could move past it, I knew the truth. We couldn't. A few days later, Caleb packed his things and left. I didn't stop him. Because deep down, I knew it was the only way we could both move forward. But moving forward didn't mean forgetting. I still think about him sometimes, the way he made me feel alive, the way he looked at me like I was the only woman in the world. But then I remember the wreckage we left behind, the broken trust, the shattered family, and I remind myself that some lines aren't meant to be crossed. And once you cross them, there's no going back. The house felt empty after Caleb left. For days, I wandered from room to room, replaying everything that had happened. The moment Eric found out, the anger in his eyes, the sound of the door slamming behind him. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The divorce papers arrived a week later. No note. No explanation. Just signatures and legal jargon that finalized the destruction of my marriage. I stared at them for hours before finally signing. I wanted to call Eric to explain, to beg for forgiveness. But what was there to say? No apology could fix what I had done. Caleb tried to reach out. He sent texts, left voicemails, and even showed up at the house once. But I didn't answer. I couldn't face him. Not after everything we had ruined. I started sleeping in the guest room because being in the bed I once shared with Eric felt unbearable. At night, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd let my life spiral so far out of control. The guilt was suffocating. I thought about how it all started, how innocent it had seemed at first. A touch here, a glance there. I had told myself it was harmless, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I wasn't just lonely. I was desperate, to feel wanted, to feel alive, to feel anything other than invisible. And Caleb had given me that. But at what cost? I had destroyed my marriage and my family, and now I was completely alone. I tried to move on, but every corner of the house reminded me of what I had lost. The couch where Caleb and I sat too close. The kitchen where Eric and I used to share lazy Sunday breakfasts. The bedroom where it all fell apart. I stopped going out, afraid of running into people who knew what had happened. The whispers, the judgment, it was too much to bear. I thought about selling the house, but even that felt like running away. Instead, I stayed and forced myself to live with the consequences. I started seeing a therapist, hoping she could help me make sense of it all. "What were you looking for?" she asked during one of our sessions. I didn't have an answer. Maybe I had been searching for a way to feel alive again. Maybe I had been searching for escape. But all I found was regret. I poured myself into work, volunteering, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the memories lingered. I thought about Caleb often, where he was, what he was doing, if he thought about me too. But I knew reaching out to him would only make things worse. He deserved better than this. And so did I. Over time, the calls and texts from him stopped. The silence that followed was both a relief and a heartbreak. I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss him. His touch, his voice, the way he made me feel. But missing him didn't make it right. I learned to live with the emptiness, to let it remind me of the mistakes I never wanted to make again. The hardest part wasn't losing Eric or Caleb. It was losing myself. I didn't recognize the woman I had become. The woman who lied, who betrayed, who crossed every line she swore she'd never cross. And even though I was rebuilding my life, I knew that woman would always be a part of me. A reminder of how easy it is to lose everything when you let loneliness and desire take control. I still wear my wedding ring sometimes. Not because I think Eric will come back, but because it reminds me of what I had, and what I lost. I keep Caleb's notes too, tucked away in a drawer I rarely open. Maybe one day I'll throw them out. But for now, they're a reminder of how dangerous it is to let emotions go unchecked, to chase passion without thinking about the consequences. Because no matter how thrilling it feels in the moment, the aftermath isn't worth it. And some mistakes leave scars that never fully heal. Months passed, but the shadows of what happened lingered. I often found myself standing in the doorway of the bedroom I used to share with Eric, running my fingers over the indentations in the pillows, imagining how things could have been different. But no amount of wishing could undo what I had done. Therapy helped me begin the process of rebuilding, not just my life, but my sense of self. I realized that what happened with Caleb wasn't just about him. It was about me, about the loneliness, the emptiness, and the parts of myself I had neglected for so long. I had been searching for passion, for validation, for something to fill the void that Eric's absence left. But the truth was, no one else could fix what was broken inside me. I had to do that myself. I spent time focusing on the things I had ignored for years: my art, my health, my happiness. It wasn't easy. There were days when the guilt crept in, when I couldn't look at myself in the mirror without seeing the woman who betrayed her husband. But I learned to sit with those feelings, to accept them as part of my story. I also learned to forgive myself, not because what I did was excusable, but because I couldn't move forward if I stayed trapped in the past. As for Eric, he never spoke to me again. I heard through mutual friends that he moved out of state and was starting over. I wanted to reach out to apologize one more time, but I knew it wouldn't change anything. And Caleb? I never saw him again. There were moments when I wondered if he ever thought about me, if he regretted what happened as much as I did. But I knew that reaching out would only reopen wounds that were finally starting to heal. Instead, I focused on myself. I started painting again, pouring my emotions into colors and brushstrokes. I traveled, explored new places, and met new people. Slowly, I began to feel whole again, not because someone else made me feel that way, but because I learned how to love myself. Looking back, I know what I did was wrong. I crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and I paid the price for it. But I also learned something valuable: loneliness is dangerous. It creeps in slowly, quietly, until it becomes unbearable. And if you don't face it head-on, it can make you do things you never thought you were capable of. I've made peace with my past, but I carry the lessons with me every day. I learned that passion without boundaries is destructive. That secrets have a way of unraveling, no matter how hard you try to keep them buried. And that no relationship, no matter how exciting, can replace the love and trust you lose when you betray someone who believed in you. I'll never make the same mistake again. Because now I know that true happiness doesn't come from someone else. It comes from within, from knowing who you are, what you need, and having the courage to ask for it before it's too late. I'm not proud of my story, but I've accepted it as part of who I am, a reminder of how easily desire can cloud judgment and how important it is to face your emotions before they control you. And if sharing my story can stop someone else from making the same mistake, then maybe it wasn't all for nothing. What would you have done in my situation? Could you resist temptation, or would loneliness push you to cross the line? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your opinions. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more shocking, emotional stories about love, betrayal, and second chances. Stay tuned. You won't believe what's coming next.